Hello, everybody. My name is Patrice Onwuka. Welcome to the Independent Women's Forum Center for Economic Opportunity. This is our center for our home for economic, labor, and tech policy. And today we are launching our inaugural policy chat. Please, if you like this video, please follow our work at iwf.org, and you can sign up for our monthly newsletter as well for commentary and analysis. But today's topic is very pertinent. Back to school and back to work, women in the labor force. So we're going to have a policy discussion really focused on women. Now, my toddler joined many kids in going back to school this school year. Actually, today was his first day. And, this fall, we've got back to school season. Many kids are going to be this is the first time they're going to be in a physical classroom since March of last year when schools were shut down and parents transitioned to working from home. Now, some parents did not have that option, as we know, and women shouldered much of the caregiving duties, including overseeing their kids' virtual learning education. Many made some choices about employment that have continued to ripple across our economy. So we're going to discuss those decisions today, the impacts that they have, and the policy implications. I am excited for today's panelists. Joining me are three women in the policy world who, if you don't already follow them, you better start following them now. We've got Rachel Gressler. She's a senior fellow from the Heritage Foundation. Karen Lips is president of the Network for Enlightened Women. And Angela Rashidi is senior fellow and Rose Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Now, between us, we calculated 16 children. So this topic is absolutely pertinent to us and to so many women across the country. Ladies, welcome to this policy chat.
Thanks, Patrice.
Yeah, thanks, Patrice.
Wonderful. Well, I'm happy to have you. So today we're just going to dive right in with some questions. To our audience, if you have a specific question, do drop that in the chat because we're going to leave some time towards the end for a Q&A discussion. But I've got tons and tons of questions as well. So first off, we're going to talk about the overall looking at women in the workforce, particularly working mothers. And we know that at least maybe 2.5 million mothers dropped out of the labor force, many of whom may not have come back for many different reasons. So I'm going to kick it off by talking to everyone with this broad question. Why do we think women's labor force participation has flattened prior to the pandemic and post-pandemic? What are we expecting to see? We know that some women have come back and some haven't, but I would love to hear from each of you. We'll start off with Rachel, we'll go to Karen, then we'll go to Angela. What are you seeing in terms of women in the labor force, particularly working mothers?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw a really steep decrease in the number of women who were employed, both because the jobs that they were more often represented in were more of the jobs that were lost, and also because they were more likely to be the ones to stay home with children who no longer had school and childcare access. And so we've heard of it being a she-cession, and that was true at the beginning. But women have largely recovered, especially if you look at statistics like the number of unemployed women. And that's actually only 3.9 million unemployed women compared to 4.8 million unemployed men. And we've also seen things like higher wage growth for women. Their earnings are up 5.4% since the pandemic compared to 3.5% for men. And yet we still have seen a little bit fewer women that are coming back into the labor force, but they're pretty close on par to men right now. And so I think it's really an issue of the choices that have been made coming out of this. And I think it's wrong that there's this notion out there now that women's labor force participation, that the goal should be the same as men's. We've heard politicians on the left put a price tag on the so-called lost potential and earnings of economic output because women aren't working as frequently as they possibly could be if they were men. But that completely dismisses the value of the things that women are doing when they're not working in the formal labor force, such as raising children, volunteering at charities, or caring for family members. And so I think it's an unrealistic goal to say that women should be having the same labor force participation as men, because we know that only about a third of mothers prefer full-time labor force participation compared to 70% of fathers. And so I think the policy question should be, are the opportunities out there? are women able to pursue the jobs or the balance between work and family that works best for them?
Karen.
Yeah, well, I think Rachel really hit on the question of how we measure success, right? So, excuse me, it seems like it's easy to just focus on parity as a measure of success, but really we should be focused on opportunity. And in particular, I'm really interested in discussing ways that we can support more options for everyone, including working moms. So we need to think about how those policies that often come out of Washington end up having unintended consequences and hurting the people they maybe are intended to help, working moms, by ultimately limiting options. So I know there's been some powerful stories that have come out about how policies that have impacted the gig economy have hurt working moms. Occupational licensing, we need some reforms there. So I'm happy to talk about some of those more later, but I think it's really important to focus not just on one model of what a woman in the workforce should look like and just really limiting it to a 9-to-5 full-time employee.
Great. Angela.
Yeah, I'll just add, Rachel and Karen are exactly right. And I think the key point is about preferences and choices. And so what I would like to just add to what both Rachel and Karen just said is that to the extent that our policies can reflect preferences, that should be our goal. And that's not always necessarily, or it doesn't always necessarily fall entirely on the government. It also should be falling on employment or workforce policies. And by that, I mean, Rachel's exactly right that when you look at survey data, about a third of mothers say that their preference would be full-time work. Another third, their preference would be part-time work. So that means that 2/3 of mothers actually do want to work to some extent, with the remaining wanting to stay home and care for their children full-time. When you cross-check that with the data on the work situation of mothers, we see that for the stay-at-home moms, those preferences are largely met with a little bit of slack on each side. What preferences are not being met is the preference for part-time work. And I think that's a combination of both government policies around childcare. For all of us who are mothers, it's rather difficult to find part-time childcare in an affordable way that meets the needs of your family. So that's one issue. And I think there's a role for government to maybe revisit regulations, things like that can make it easier for childcare providers to provide part-time care. And the other is just workplace policy, again, flexibility that can be provided to really all parents or all workers, not just mothers. But since we're focusing on mothers, they're the ones who have really expressed a desire to have flexibility, to be able to work a reduced schedule so that they can balance both their home life and their work life.
That's great. Flexibility is going to be one of those key words that pop up during our discussion today, not surprisingly, because it's so important, not just to working mothers, but particularly coming out of the pandemic, to many workers across our labor force. It's interesting to see the survey data that says, a majority of workers would quit their job if they were able to get another one that allowed them to work from home, for example, a certain number of days a week, or added increased flexibility. So that's going to be a key word for our discussion today. Now, childcare. Angela, I'm going to kick this back to you. That's a huge topic. Obviously, for parents young people who are thinking of having children, as well as parents who are in that child bearing age, how do you pay for something, or how do you get childcare to be able to cover that, to take care of your children before they may be school aged, and while freeing up your time to be able to pursue entrepreneurship or to pursue full-time employment in the workforce. So let's talk a little bit more about childcare. Do you think, Angela, that a lack of childcare is causing a reduction of labor force participation by women, both before the pandemic as well as after?
It's a really good question, and it's one that I struggle with a little bit because, and I'll tell you why. One is that we know research shows that when you have policies that make childcare more affordable, it increases labor force participation among women in general, but mostly mothers. So there is a relationship there. But to answer your question directly, do I think that a lack of childcare is causing a labor force participation rate among mothers that is not optimal? I'm not sure that the data necessarily bears that out. That doesn't mean that a lack of affordable childcare or childcare challenges are not issues, but we don't see this in the survey data. It hasn't gotten to the point where you have mothers who are saying, I just cannot find childcare, and that is preventing me from being in the labor force entirely. It is more about challenges with childcare. It's more about not completely meeting the preferences of families, maybe not having the most convenient childcare provider, or maybe not the highest quality childcare provider, or just the challenges of trying to cobble together childcare. I think that that's where our focus should be. It should be how do we revisit not only our government policies, but again, our workplace policies to make childcare better meet the needs of families. And I think that's the real question. It's not so much a lack of childcare altogether.
Others want to jump in on this?
Sure.
Well, go ahead, Rachel.
I just wanted to say that there are childcare struggles, and certainly there are ways that there could be more flexible and affordable options out there. But the childcare struggle is not unique to COVID-19. The problems that were out there existed before it. And there was an interesting study by Jason Furman and some others, who was President Obama's former chair of his Council of Economic Advisors. And they kind of said, shockingly, childcare struggles are not weighing on mothers' or fathers' employment. They've actually had slightly less employment declines since COVID-19. And so they didn't expect to find that, but that was the case. And so I think that it's not particular to the pandemic, and that we should be looking at these policies in ways that look at more flexible, more affordable options, as opposed to just blanket childcare subsidies.
Well, and I think Angela's point was really key, where she says that you need to meet the preferences of what parents actually want, where it seems like what's been coming out of this current administration is kind of one view of institutionalized childcare, that they think that that's the majority and what most people want, when it not necessarily is.
Well, and that's a great point, Karen, because I think, speaking of coming out of Washington, right now we're in the midst of a debate over two very large pieces of legislation that would expand federal taxpayer dollars, obviously spent on domestic priorities, one of which would be childcare subsidies. And that would be prioritizing government-run centers, for example. And so I just weighing in with my thoughts. I think it would be interesting in the impact it would have on private sector childcare providers, on family members who provide childcare or care for little ones. There are some families who have grandparents who are able to do that. So I think there might be an impact when you provide subsidies for a specific government-supported childcare center over those other options that are out there in the marketplace that frankly may be better. Maybe a family wants to send their child to a religious-based childcare institution where they're learning about, foundations of their faith. I would be surprised if the government were willing to subsidize a childcare center that promotes one particular faith over another. So, I think it's an interesting conversation about preferences and that individuals may have, but also whether that's, one type of center is better than another. I think let's move a little bit more. And by the way, folks, these ladies have provided some really great resources on reports that they've written, op-eds and opinion pieces that we're going to make available after this discussion goes forward. And you'll probably be seeing some of these brought up in the chat as well. But let's go into another area where we're seeing suggestions for increased government funding, which is meant to lure or nudge more women into the workplace, and that is paid leave. Again, in the $3.5 trillion human infrastructure plan that's being considered in Congress right now, it's being crafted, the actual text language, there would be money potentially for a federal paid family and medical leave plan. This would be an entirely new entitlement program. So Rachel, I'm going to kick this paid leave discussion over to you. Do you think that a lack of employer-provided paid sick and family leave is holding women back? And do we need what the Democrats, frankly, the far left, are proposing as the solution?
I don't think that paid family leave is holding women back. And if you look at some of the surveys about women and what men care about, women increasingly value flexibility far more than family leave. When a survey asked women out of 7 different options what factor would best help them balance work and family, 52% of women listed either more flexible work schedules or the ability to work remotely as being the most helpful, while only 6% said that more paid maternity and paternity leave would be the most helpful. That was actually 6th out of 7th in the list of things that would help them the most. And that's not to say that paid family leave isn't valuable. I think that women and men alike place a high value on it, rightly so, but it's that more workers already have access to it, and it's increasing, especially in light of the pandemic. If you look at government statistics, you'll hear, well, only 21% of workers have access to paid family leave. I mean, first of all, that's actually a 50% increase over just 4 years from 14% in 2016. But that statistic doesn't capture people who are actually able to take paid family leave. It leaves out the 50% of workers who have private disability insurance policies. It leaves out individuals who work for small employers who absolutely let their workers take time off, but they just don't have a formal policy. And so the true percentage of workers that have access to paid family and sick leave is probably well above 50%. But there's also been just this tremendous growth. It's already increased 50% over the last couple of years. And as I said, the pandemic, I think, has allowed employers to see that they're able to have these policies, and not only the paid family leave, but the remote work and the flexibility that I think just will become a silver lining coming out of all of this. And the reason that we've seen this increased growth in paid family leave is because it's valuable. Employees wanted it. And because employers were able to provide it when they had things like the 2016 tax cuts that left them with more resources to put back into their workers instead of having to pay that in taxes. And now we're seeing something that's the opposite being proposed, hiking taxes on businesses, and then at the same time, undercutting this growth and the more flexible and accommodating employer-provided policies and replacing those with a one-size-fits-all federal government program. And so that's what the Democrats' plan is based on, and what's included in this $3.5 trillion package is $225 billion towards a government paid family leave program that would probably provide about 12 weeks of paid family leave, replacing about 2/3 of workers' wages. It's unclear exactly how this is going to be paid for, but we can count on it being another unfunded entitlement program, because we know that when the Congressional Budget Office scored the Democrats' Family Act, they said this will cost $573 billion over 10 years. And oh, by the way, it's only going to cover about 42% of the leaves that workers need to take. And so now you compare that $573 billion with the $225 billion that the president has proposed for a paid family leave program. That's going to cover even fewer workers, probably 20% or less of the leaves that workers need to take. And so is it actually going to get to the workers that we want to help, proportionately the lower income workers who don't yet have access to paid family leave? And we can look to evidence in the US and abroad to see whether we expect that to happen. And the answer is absolutely no, because we can see that when there are state programs and when there are these programs in other countries, they disproportionately benefit wealthy and affluent families, and they hardly reach the low income families. In California, a mother in the highest income bracket is 5 times as likely as a mother in the bottom income bracket to be able to use their program. And the state has 38% of its workers who are making below $20,000 a year, and yet only 1% of them are using that program. And that's because these one-size-fits-all programs are actually rigid and restrictive, and they don't let people get the types of programs that they want, the flexible ones where they can just contact their boss directly and they don't have to go through a bureaucracy, or as in Washington State, where some people have to wait 10 weeks and take out a loan before they find out if they're ever going to get paid back when they had to stay at home with their child. And then I just want to lastly comment on this notion of human investment here, because I think absolutely paid family leave, when you're talking about it being on workers and employers' terms, that's an investment. That's why employers offer it, because it has a positive return. And I think we'll see more of that as we go forward. But if you talk about replacing something that's voluntary and flexible and accommodating with those employer-provided policies with a less efficient one-size-fits-all government program, that's the opposite of investment. And it's also bad math on Democrats' part, because there's this notion that the investments in children, if you pay somebody to stay home with their child through paid family leave, that's a positive investment. And yet, if you pay that same parent to not stay home, but to go to work and to put their child in a government-directed childcare center, that's an investment. You can't have it both ways there. And so I think that these policies that are seeking to put the government at the helm of American families by telling them what they should do is not ultimately going to help women. It's not going to help families. It's not going to help children.
Angela or Karen, want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something Rachel said about the targeting. And so I think there is a role for government to play in paid leave policy. But Rachel's exactly right that there is paid leave policies already provided through employers. And my biggest concern is that when you do have a policy like the Democrats are proposing, which would be universal, you're going to crowd out those private benefits, and you're largely just going to replace private employer provided benefits for many middle and higher income workers with a government program, which, as Rachel mentioned, is more inefficient, which is all true. But that doesn't mean that there's still not an unmet need for those lower income or lower wage workers. And so while I agree that what the Democrats have put forward is not the solution, I think we do need to have discussions about what are the right solutions. There are certainly enough stories about low-income working mothers who have to go back to work within days of giving birth, or low-wage workers having to go to work ill because they don't have paid leave. And I think as a society, we should be worried about that, but just from an economic perspective, we should be worried about that. And we should craft policies that target those individuals and can help them afford to take the time away from work that they need. The other thing I'll add is it's not easy, because I've looked at this issue a lot. I mean, what you're talking about in that case is a means-tested program or some other kind of program like that. Also not ideal, but I think that we have to get past this idea that there shouldn't be any role for government at all in this area and start to think a little bit more creatively about how we can properly target programs to reduce some of the unintended consequences of these low-wage workers not having access to any pay and any paid time off.
And I'll just add that it's not like there's just two options, right? It's not just government mandated paid leave programs versus nothing. Employers have gotten pretty creative with trying to keep a lot of working moms, or maybe soon to be working moms, in the workforce. I'm reminded in this conversation of back in 2014 when Apple started offering egg freezing benefits to employees. And that didn't come from a government mandate. That was an effort to attract and keep their female employees. So it's good to remember that there are more options out there, and it doesn't just have to be a government funded or government mandate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that flexibility needs to be there. We saw the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that I think offered 6 months or something of paid leave, and then they actually had to pull that back. And it wasn't a cost issue for them, clearly, but it was, we can't do our job when we have so many people out at the same time. And so they had to revise that policy, and they ended up, cutting large checks and having a smaller paid time off policy. But those need to be the types of decisions that employers can make. And it shouldn't come through the, government bureaucrats telling them what they can and can't do.
Well, I think you all have hit on some really key points about this discussion, which is that, if there is a role for government, does that, would a government sponsored plan crowd out those private options that are not just more generous, but maybe better tailored to the individual needs? I mean, it's easier for me to negotiate with my employer, hey, I'm going to take the time you've offered, but I'm going to take an extra few weeks of unpaid leave because I really want a few more weeks with my baby boy, so I think that flexibility also in negotiating between an employee and employer, you get that may be crowded out through some public plans. I will say at IW, at the Independent Women's Forum, we actually put forward an idea called earned leave. Some folks are familiar with it, some love it, some think it's innovative, some are like, not so much, but I think it's an interesting way of looking forward in saying, hey, as an individual, why not be able to tap into the money that individual workers already pay into the system through Social Security, be able to tap and then pay that back over time, but use that time to fund your time off. So there are lots of different approaches. I think we just popped up a screen that talks about that. Also, some of the pitfalls of this whole paid leave conversation. When you look at government universal mandated plans, our plan would be totally voluntary, which is nice. But there are lots of different approaches to it. It does not have to be, though, one size fits all. And in fact, as a woman, I wear a size 10, a size 5 is not going to fit me. And so I think that's how we should be thinking about programs to meet the needs that we may have in the workplace. Now, I said we get back to flexibility. That word has popped up here and there throughout our discussion. And I want to pivot to you, Karen, to really hammer home this flexibility discussion. You know, how are women crafting opportunities outside of the traditional 9-to-5 behind a desk type of job? And you know, what do you see any threats coming from Washington on those opportunities?
I definitely do, Patrice. We know moms and dads overall have different preferences in the economy. A Pew study found that only 37% of working moms and 22% of non-working moms prefer full-time work. How about the men? According to the research, quote, fully 75% of fathers with children under age 18 say working full-time is ideal for them. So this preference undoubtedly influences their work arrangements and childcare preferences. Not all working moms want one model, a 9-to-5 full-time job model. And my sense is that the pandemic has made flexibility even more valuable to working moms. One threat I see to this movement is a focus solely on this 9-to-5 full-time employment notion. So one issue that's been getting more national attention is employment and workplaces and independent contractors. So in September 2019, the governor of California signed AB 5 into law that restricted independent contractors, providing 3 conditions that must be met for someone to be classified as an independent contractor. Many people have shared their stories about how this has negatively impacted them, and because they didn't actually want to become full-time employees. I know IWF has been sharing a number of those stories that are really powerful and really affect the livelihood of these individuals, this new law. And at the federal level, now we've seen the House pick it up, and they passed the PRO Act in March of 2021. And it's interesting, according to one study, women make up 46% of full-time independent contractors. And some supporters of these type of laws don't realize that those steps actually might end up hurting the people they're trying to help, working moms who really want more flexibility, either full-time or part-time. And it was interesting, there was a study that came out about Door Dashers, you know, folks who deliver food for DoorDash. And women now make 58% of Door Dashers, and most aren't full-time. And a majority, 61%, have chosen that over, say, Uber or Lyft because they feel like it's safer. And 80% do it for the flexibility. So we know the flexibility really drives a lot of labor choices. So I think how policies are going to impact the gig economy can really negatively impact working moms. And then one other thing I will just mention is the occupational licensing issues. You know, states have licensing laws that are supposed to protect health and safety, but often they just go a little bit too far. It seems like they're more there as barriers to entry or to protect the current people in those jobs. And so I think it's time, and we've seen the pandemic has raised this in the field of nursing, for example, of how do we protect health and safety in a legitimate way without, you know, over limiting how much people can work and making it too difficult for people to work. So those are 2 threats, Patrice, that I see at the national level, is how our policies are impacting those who work in the gig economy and occupational licensing laws.
Great.
And can I just add to what Karen's saying, because it's and this is at the state level, but to bring it back to childcare, these same issues are affecting childcare providers, so in-home childcare providers. So you can imagine a mom who has some young children and she wants to earn some extra money. So she's like, well, I can start my own in-home childcare center or provider. And she starts to realize, though, the state regulations that are placed on childcare providers, and that she falls into that category. And it becomes extremely onerous to start a childcare business for many of these women. And not only starting, but what we've seen over the past really decade is just this exodus of in-home childcare providers from the overall childcare market that has largely been absorbed by large daycare facilities. So childcare slots haven't necessarily declined, but we have seen a huge decline in childcare providers. And it is largely these moms who have in the past been able to open up businesses out of their home and provide childcare, but are increasingly finding that it just doesn't make sense from a business perspective, given the regulations and the requirements that they have to follow. So I think we really need to take a hard look at state requirements at the childcare level that makes it easier for women to start businesses in that sector as well.
Anything, Rachel?
Sorry, yes, I was on mute. I just wanted to tag on that decline in the number of small in-home providers. Just between 2005 and 2017, there was a 50% drop off in these smaller in-home providers, and they tend to be about 25 to 30% less expensive. And they're also the providers that are more likely to be able to provide part-time care, more flexible care. And I know that in my own state, in Maryland, if I just wanted to have a friend of mine watch my kids one day a week after school for a couple hours, either she would have to convert her home into a licensed childcare facility, which is extremely expensive and burdensome, or else if she were to come to my home, I would have to treat her as a formal employee. I'd have to file with the state and Social Security and the federal government and become an employer, and she would be my employee. And so it's extremely burdensome. And then also on the independent workers, that's often talked about as just the gig economy, and people think of Uber and Lyft drivers, but it's 1 out of 3 Americans participate in freelance work every year. This is not just the gig economy. It's, editors, it's moms that are selling on Etsy, it's ones who are selling for Pampered Chef or Mary Kay. It's all different types of people who are able to work on their own terms. It's anybody who acts as their own boss. And 46% of those people who do freelance say that they do it because they can't work for a traditional employer. And so you are effectively cutting out the opportunity to work for all those people if you say that the only job out there for you is for you to become that normal 9-to-5 employee to answer to your boss.
Fantastic. I mean, I think to pick up on a couple of points that you guys have made, an interesting statistic that I find, it blows me away. In 2018 and 2019, women started 1,820 businesses each day in our country. This is according to the American Express Advisors annual Women in Business report. It's astonishing how entrepreneurship has taken a hold among women, and particularly women of color. They're probably one of the fastest growing small business owners in the country. And I think part of it is what we've been talking about today, the big F word, flexibility. I mean, Rachel, you gave some great examples, whether you're selling Mary Kay or maybe, as Karen, you mentioned, you're a DoorDash driver, maybe you're an editor, a writer. It's phenomenal the number. You could be a transcriber, translating English to Spanish in courtrooms. I mean, a florist, an event planner who has a business that's not, that depends on events, and you hire independent contractors, to help you manage the weddings during wedding season. It's tremendous the number of businesses and entrepreneurial enterprises that women launch into, looking for that flexibility. And whether you want to be a childcare provider as well. I mean, all of these issues kind of work together. And the big message that I'm hearing from you all is that there can be really significant negative unintended consequences to greater government involvement in private enterprises and private family decisions and private personal career decisions. And so I really want our audience to hear what we're saying, which is that there is a role for government in different areas, sure, but very often what we're seeing, and particularly right now coming out of Washington, is a very strong movement towards inserting government into in making these decisions for us. We're smart, we're thinking people, we can make the decisions for ourselves. So if you have questions, we would love to take some questions from the audience over the next maybe 10 minutes that we have left, maybe 9 minutes that we have left. But I'll kick it back. Another question to all of you guys is another F word, which we haven't touched: fulfillment. So there may be women, and I read a fantastic New York Times article where women were interviewed who have been in corporate America for years, or maybe they worked in an educational setting. The pandemic sent them home to oversee their kids' education, like so many of us, and they fell in love with being at home. And they fell in love with, taking care of their kids. And frankly, they're tired of the rat race, or they find greater fulfillment in being at home, or maybe they're starting their own little small enterprise themselves. Do you guys, are you seeing that as well? Do we think that fulfillment may be another reason why women are leaving the labor force? And if so, is that a bad thing? I mean, it seems like from a lot of feminists and folks on the left, women need to get back into the workforce. But what if people are more fulfilled not being in the workforce? So I'm just opening it up to anybody who wants to jump in on that question.
Well, I'll just jump in quick. I mean, I do think we underestimate the kind of fulfillment issue. But I think it's also, again, back to this issue of one size fits all. I mean, I think part of the reason that some women choose to leave employment entirely and stay home full time is because the current model in our workplaces just does not fit what many mothers want. And that does come back to flexibility, but also just a recognition that people are more than just their work life. And so, I mean, there's kind of competing survey data, but back to that original survey, I mean, there's still the majority of moms want to work. It's just the majority don't want to work full time. And to extrapolate a little bit, they likely don't want to work the 9 to 5 schedule where you have to be sitting at your desk for the entire day. So I think, again, if we take a look at more workplace policies, how can we make working life easier for mothers and more compatible with the type of family life they want? Because I think from both an economy-wide issue, it is an economist would tell you if we can maximize labor force participation among women, we'll be better off. And so there is value to having women working. I mean, we all work, right? There is value to having women working. I think where we sometimes don't pay enough attention is that we want to make it easier for women to work and not necessarily place all these constraints on them, or it has to be, I'm either going to work this full-time job that I don't really like, or I'm going to be home full time, which I maybe am a little more fulfilled, but not completely fulfilled because I want to be, I also want to have a career and have a working life. So I think it's a balance. So I'll add to the F word, the B word, which is balance. And I think we need to pay more attention to the balance side of things versus the one or all or nothing kind of approach.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, I'd say it's balance that's based off of each woman, each man, every family's unique desires. And so I don't like the message to women that, hey, you can have it all. You can have this great career and climb the ladder and you can be the best mom, because you can't. But what is important is that women can make the choices that are best for them. And that's where I see, potential divergence here with so-called investing other people's money into pushing women to make certain decisions, pushing children into certain situations. And so I think that if we see a slight leveling off or even a decline in the labor force participation of women, that's not a bad thing if that's a choice that they are making. And I hope that there will be more independent work opportunities for women who have young children at home who are caring for aging parents. And I know among my own peer group, that's the most common type of job that my friends perform, is just independent work. And so I hope that that is out there, because that does allow people to make a positive contribution as you measure it to the economy, but also to be able to be home when they want to and to have that flexibility. And then just one note, in terms of what we can expect this fall. Prior to the pandemic, about 3.2% of children in grades K to 12 were homeschooled. The last fall, that was up to 11.1%.
Wow.
We don't have the figures yet for this fall, but it's probably pretty similar because a lot of those homeschooling families realize I'm not going back. And so there might be a shift to more women being at home and providing that teaching role as well to their children. And if that's a choice they make, that's a net positive for them and for society.
Yeah, and I'll say, Patrice, that during the pandemic, I've gotten tired of reading headline after headline about how horrible it has been on working moms. There have definitely been challenges, but I think we've maybe not focused as much on some of the silver linings that have come out of it. Patrice, I interviewed one of your colleagues, Julie Gunlock, who's been very outspoken about how during the pandemic, her and her family decided to start homeschooling one of their sons. And as Rachel mentioned, a lot of people have made that choice, and that's worked out tremendously well for her and her family. And so coming out of this pandemic, she's still homeschooling one of her 3 sons. And I interviewed another young woman, Bethany Mandel, who decided to have a 5th child during the pandemic. So we can't just measure success for women purely by parity, going back to how we started this conversation. But again, as Angela mentioned, focusing on that opportunity. We want women to have opportunity to build the lives they want to build, to find fulfillment. And the pandemic has, for many, led them to a path that maybe is more non-traditional, maybe been something they've been really thinking about, but kind of pushed them over the edge. And in a way, there are some silver linings there for a lot of people.
I love that because I think it's really important. With our last couple of minutes left, I'll pose this to the group and kick off with my thoughts. Many people will push back and say, oh, well, you guys, you look like middle class working moms. You're blessed to be able to work remotely. Maybe you have that ability. But what about maybe the single mom who is not in the middle class? Maybe she's maybe lower class. Maybe her income doesn't exactly hit the median national income, for example. She probably has fewer choices than you guys are talking about. So how do we expand some opportunities or choices for those women and women, across the scale, but particularly those who don't have access to all of those opportunities that we're talking, those flexible opportunities. And I will just say, now kick it to you guys to weigh in. But I do think that independent contracting, that the small business environment has actually been really great for individuals who, don't necessarily have a lot of startup capital to invest in their small business. We've seen that it can be difficult for people to attract investment when they have that great idea. And we've seen how, technology, particularly the smartphone, has been fantastic in expanding those types of ways of kind of building that side hustle, so to speak. Building the small business, maybe allowing you to leverage your time, your talent, your time and your talent in ways that allow the market to pay you. And that could grow into something that becomes your full funding source or your full income source. And so when we think about, as Karen really well laid out, those threats to independent contracting at the state level, but particularly at the federal level, it's incumbent on all of us to push back. These are not just high income or middle income workers. We're talking about people who are putting themselves through school and are using apps to do so. Maybe they're on Fiverr and they're building websites or they're photographers for an Instagram influencer, but that's a business and that's a way for them to make income. So I do think it's really critical that we think about how we can expand those flexible opportunities for everyone across the different income aspects of our income scale. Anyone else have thoughts on that last question?
Yeah, I think that politicians jump to, especially talking about lower income or single mothers, how can we spend money to help them? But I think the first question should be, how can we break down the existing barriers that are preventing them from pursuing the choices that are best for them? And Angela talked about licensing reform. Why should a mom have to go through time-consuming training and pay costly fees in order to braid hair or to arrange flowers? And so having there be more opportunities that are out there for women to pursue using the skills they already have. And then on the childcare front, how can we make it more flexible, affordable? How can we let families just take the current subsidies that are out there for childcare and say they prefer family care from a relative, or say they prefer the church down the street? How can we make it easier for them to use that money that's already being spent at a facility of their choice?
Great.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I think Rachel's last point about how do we look at what's already provided and just reform those programs so it meets people's needs better is really key. Because, I mean, we're always going to have a situation where there's going to be low-income families where we actually need to encourage labor force participation because that's their path out of poverty and path towards opportunity. And that sometimes means providing them with some government assistance. So things like childcare assistance, things like paid leave that are going to help them kind of weather economic shocks. And so we can do that, but we have so many programs that already exist. We just need to take a look at those programs from the perspective of, are we using these programs to encourage labor force participation, not detract from it? And I think we have too many programs provided by the government that are actually disincentivizing employment rather than helping people get in the labor market and help them move up the economic ladder. And that should really be our focus.
And I'll just push real briefly on the occupational licensing reform point again, that I think that's something that can affect people across the socioeconomic spectrum, is something that I'd love to see more reform at the state level.
Awesome. Well, guys, I wanted to keep it to 45 minutes. We've done pretty well at that, which is good. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Rachel, Karen, and Angela, for a really robust discussion about women in the workforce. And I hope that we push back on the narrative somewhat that women are helpless, hapless, and we don't have any choices. In fact, maybe what we're seeing are women enjoying lots of different choices in how to use their time in the labor force. So thank you for your time today. Thank you for joining me, guys.
Thanks, Patrice.
Awesome. And thank you to our audience. I appreciate you hanging with us during our little lunch discussion today. This policy chat is not going to be, it's the first, but it will not be the last. So please, if you want to know about our next chat, sign up for our newsletter. It's called The Pointer. And you'll get news and alerts from IWF Center for Economic Opportunity. Go to iwf.org/CEO. We are the CEO. So until next time, we hope you will be well, strive, and thrive. Thanks, everyone.